This video is brought to you by Mubi, a curated online streaming service showing exceptional films from around the globe. Get your first month for free at mubi.com/royalocean. It's the night before Christmas. And like we do every year, my family sits down together to watch It's a Wonderful Life.
Merry Christmas, you wonderful Billy and Lone!
It's a movie all of us love and practically know by heart. And for me, it's one of those movies that somehow resonates more and more every year that goes by. Every time that I see it, George Bailey gets a little bit more endearing, and the earnestness in Jimmy Stewart's performance becomes a little bit more enviable.
I'm shaking the dust of this crummy little town off my feet, and I'm gonna see the world!
But this time, something different happens. This time, I find myself struck by a strange thought, a question I'd never thought before but suddenly needed to have answered. Did Jimmy Stewart ever play a villain? Just 2 years into Stewart's Hollywood career, he was cast as the antagonist in 2 of the, count 'em, 6 films that W.S. Van Dyke directed in 1936. The first, a convict on the run after killing a Mountie in the musical Rose-Marie, is nothing much to write home about.
You think there'd be much excitement about this back in Montreal?
What?
You bringing me in.
The role a pretty tiny one, with Stewart only on screen for a couple of minutes. The character overall acting mostly as the film's unseen MacGuffin, the object of attention his character's sister searches for nearly the entire film's runtime. He counts as the antagonist, but only technically, and is a fairly sympathetic one at that. But the key film that cast Stewart at his most villainous was the second.
I asked you all down here because we found another murder had been committed here.
The murder mystery After the Thin Man, the first sequel in the popular series revolving around the fast-talking, constantly sauced husband and wife crack team Nick and Nora Charles, solving mysteries, taking names, and just in general having a grand old time.
Darling, you don't need mystery. You got something much better, something more alluring.
What?
Me.
You!
Here, the entire plot hinges on Stewart's character, David, who, get ready, is the former lover of Nora's cousin Selma, who's married to Robert, who's seeing Polly, who's plotting with a club owner named Dancer to steal the money that David is bribing Robert with so that he'll grant Selma a divorce. Except everything suddenly gets all bungled up when Robert is gunned down and Selma framed as the prime suspect. It's all rather complicated, really. Anyway, the moment that everything leads to is this.
All this time, I've been waiting for someone to make a slip.
Nick's climactic reconstruction of the entire case, in which the identity of Robert's killer is revealed to be none other than David himself.
I've hated her, hated them both ever since she threw me over for Robert. I've been planning and waiting and watching for the time to come when I could get even with them for ruining my life. I killed Robert, but not the way I wanted to. It was too quick, too easy. I wanted to see him suffer like he'd made me suffer. I wanted to see you hang. I wanted to see you go gradually madder and madder and madder until the day finally came when you were going to hang. Well, I made a mess out of everything, all right. I don't want a single move out of anyone. All right, Selma. I may not see you hang, but I'm going to see you die.
Don't be a fool, David.
I got 6 bullets in this gun. 1 for her, 1 for myself. Yeah, 1 for myself.
Stewart may not have thought awfully highly of his performance, and for as much as the role of a psychotic killer counters the wholesome all-American image that we have of him, it's a striking early signal of something that would become a staple that nearly all of the great Stewart performances share.
I wanted to see him suffer like he'd made me suffer.
A sense of insecurity and vulnerability bubbling underneath that eventually bursts forth uncontrollably. There's a through line from this outburst here that stretches across his entire filmography. It's a premonition and the beginning of the most important story of his career.
Cinderella's slipper. It's called champagne. Champagne is a great leveler. It makes you my equal.
Well, I wouldn't quite say that.
Well, almost my equal.
See, Stewart hit the stratosphere almost immediately following After the Thin Man, when a string of successful comedies like You Can't Take It With You and The Shop Around the Corner, and his iconic portrait of homespun decency and upstanding moral fiber in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, turned him and the easygoing, folksy everyman persona he brought to the screen into a bona fide star. But then, everything was interrupted. The Second World War changed everything for Stewart, and when he returned to the industry after his 5 years of military service, he was not only understandably shaken and scarred from his experiences, but his return was to an industry that had seemingly passed him by.
It was sort of a nebulous period in my career because I didn't exactly know whether the type of thing that I'd done before, whether that would be accepted. And it turned out that it wasn't very accepted. It's a Wonderful Life didn't do very well.
Didn't it?
And the next picture didn't do very well. And it was sort of falling back on that sort of thing that I'd gotten into, the romantic comedy, and the people didn't want that.
Yeah.
It's an ages-old tale for anyone who's managed to find their way into the spotlight, and a word of caution for those still waiting their turn about the fickle, fleeting nature of audience interests and the inevitability of falling from favor. But for Stewart, as it is for those who managed to ride out the storm, it was a story that turned on a peculiar twist. The inaugural year of the 1950s may have ended with Jimmy charming the pants off of everyone with his invisible rabbit friend, but it was preceded just months earlier by the film that came to mark the major pivot point in the direction of his career. From the very beginning of Winchester 73, there's something different about his performance, a kind of weathered disposition that hangs over every word and every look.
That's Dutch Henry Brown. I thought you said you didn't know him.
We meet Stewart's character, Lynn McAdam, in the midst of pursuing a fugitive with whom he has a score to settle. And as the story unfolds, we come to see that he's utterly hell-bent on revenge, chasing this man presumably for years, and in the process has become disillusioned, haunted, and consumed by violence.
Hunting for food, that's all right. Hunting a man to kill him, you're beginning to like it.
Well, that's where you're wrong. I don't like it. Some things a man has to do, so he does them.
Winchester 73's is a primeval story of brutality and vengeance, with a reading of the West that's less romantic than it is coarse, capturing a harshness in its view of the frontier. And for Stewart, the acclaim that the film and his performance were met with marked nothing less than the redefinition of his on-screen persona and the beginning of what would become the richest period of his entire career. A period that saw him shed the boyish charms of his pre-war films in exchange for hardened characters like Lynn McAdam, each of them increasingly marked by a kind of lingering trauma, and who each descended further and further into morally ambiguous territory, where, as the joke goes, Jimmy became James.
I just can't make you understand, can I, Ben? I don't need other people. I don't need help. I can take care of me.
It's worth noting, though, that this period was preempted by his roles in It's a Wonderful Life and Alfred Hitchcock's Rope, both of which touched on a darker, shakier side of the typical Stewart personality, anticipating the characters he would go on to play in the 50s. Characters who, as academic Dennis Bingham noted, often started at the point where someone like George Bailey was at his very darkest. Winchester 73 marked the first of 8 collaborations between Stewart and auteur director Anthony Mann, 5 of them westerns that represent some of the genre's best offerings, that push Stewart to his psychological limits, and that just so happened to revitalize his career.
Where are they? Where are they? Where did they take it? Where did they take it?
I actually feel that if I hadn't, at that point, if I hadn't started and done westerns, if I hadn't gotten into that part of the business, it would have been, I don't think I would have made it.
The characters he portrayed in Mann's films were perhaps less distinct from one another and more a variation on the same basic outline, each a hard-edged loner almost always harboring a secret from the past that both haunts them and prompts whatever action it is that they pursue. For Winchester's Lynn McAdam, that's revenge against a man revealed to be his own flesh and blood, the brother he seeks to kill for the cold-blooded murder of their own father. For Bend of the River's Glenn McClintock, it's redemption for a vicious criminal past.
Who are you running away from? A man by the name of Glenn McClintock.
But as these things typically go, it's an escape that seems nigh impossible. Like Michael Corleone, as soon as he thinks he's clinched it, the past catches up. And every bit of rage that defined an earlier life comes roaring back to the surface.
Every time you bed down for the night, you'll look back into the darkness and wonder if I'm there. And some night I will be. You'll be seeing me.
In fact, the more that Stewart and Mann worked together, the more that Stewart's characters became models of repression. Scarred men covering up their past, resisting violence, suppressing rage, but exploding when pressed too hard and driven too far.
Why don't you face up to it?
Unlike his earlier films, Stewart was no longer the moral center, the voice of reason and righteousness, but instead the firebrand whose selfish pursuit winds up blinding him to a sense of morality. Depicted at its best in The Naked Spur, where he's practically unhinged, a loose cannon so high-strung that he's rendered almost hysterical.
I'm taking him back! This is what I came after, and now I got it! No partners like I started!
But for as far as any of these characters may wade into ambiguous waters, they're always brought back to light by those around them. The Far Country is ostensibly the story of a brooding loner finding a community to believe in and fight for. But more often than not, it's the women around him who occupy that moral center, melting the hard exterior he's built up and revealing the vulnerability underneath.
All right, if that's the way you want it, I'll ride with you. I'll ride with you all the way.
I'm taking him back.
I know. I'll marry you. I'll go with you. I'll even live in that land with you. What else do you want from me?
Why? Tell me why. I'm taking him back, I swear it. I'm gonna sell him for money.
It's that dichotomy that was at the heart of so many of Stewart's roles. And the balance he was able to achieve in embodying such tormented men was so well realized that it was heartbreaking. And if it was something that Anthony Mann tapped into, then it was something he handed back to Alfred Hitchcock to mine for all it was worth. Where someone like Mr. Smith was dignified and incorruptible, Stewart's characters in Rear Window and Vertigo were certifiably perverse. Jeff, a snooping creep, and Scotty, an obsessive manipulator virtually possessed by the ghost of a fantasy woman he desperately tries to reconstruct. The havoc wreaked in both of their lives stemming in large part from their own curiosity, their own illicit fixations.
Jeff, if you could only see yourself.
What's the matter?
Sitting around looking
Out of his long career, I think these two roles stand as the apex of Stewart's long line of darker characters, the end of the road that After the Thin Man laid the very initial groundwork for. Heck, if you wanted, you could draw a line connecting David and Scotty, both of them variations on the story of a tormented man and his fetishistic obsession with the woman he loves and tries to control, but ultimately cannot possess. You could say that After the Thin Man predicted Vertigo in that sense, or that Vertigo fulfilled the potential that After the Thin Man suggested.
You shouldn't keep souvenirs of a killing. You shouldn't have been... You shouldn't have been that sentimental. I loved you so, man.
You know, Stewart once said that the westerns he starred in allowed him to toughen up and yet still retain what he was. But I actually think that that's something that's even truer for the Hitchcock films. There's a magic trick that sits at the heart of Rear Window and Vertigo, and it's Hitchcock getting the world's foremost likable everyman to dive into a world of forbidden desire but somehow still maintain his affable, earnest nature. Truly, I think there are few other actors who could have played either of these roles and not just simply come across like a completely vile pervert.
If I let you change me, will that do it? I do what you tell me. Will you love me?
Yes.
It's the balance that Stewart's able to bring that's so compelling, in effect making the darkness that he sinks into not just palatable but identifiable, making the characters simultaneously despicable and sympathetic, and rendering the taboo not sensational but average and ordinary. What sells the twisted darkness of Jeff and Scotty, I would argue, is the extent to which they fit in right alongside Stewart's characters preceding this. What I mean to say is that, despite the darkness that consumes them, this wasn't so much the case of an actor playing a role against type. Not like, say, for instance, the cold-hearted psychopath that Stewart's best bud Henry Fonda played in Once Upon a Time in the West that stood in total contrast from his own affable all-American image, but instead was a filling out of that very persona, a dark, hidden shadow brought into light. They may not be wholesome Mr. Smith going hoarse in front of Congress or George Bailey facing down horrid Mr. Potter, but Jeff playing detective on his neighbors and Scotty falling down the rabbit hole of obsession, you don't get much more human, more all-American everyman than this.
Well, he was a peeping Tom, aren't we all?
And I think that was one of Stewart's greatest talents. From the very beginning and until the very end, he wrenched humanity out of darkness and played it as altogether normal. The everyman who just so happened to also be his own worst enemy, his own villain. And aren't we all? Hey everybody, thanks so much for watching. I hope you're all enjoying the holiday season, and if you're looking for any great last-minute gifts, I highly recommend Mubi. Mubi is a curated online streaming service that premieres a new film every day. From exciting up-and-coming filmmakers to timeless classics from master directors to cult favorites you've never seen, there's always something new to discover. With Mubi, every film comes lovingly handpicked and curated. And because of that, I've found that I wind up spending way less time browsing through endless titles and adding things to watch lists, and more time actually watching. It's a much more streamlined strategy in that sense, and it's one that I think is pretty brilliant. And for me, it's resulted in the discovery of quite a few new gems, a number of which I'd never even heard of before. If there's a film lover in your life that you'd like to give the gift of cinema to this holiday season, you can check out mubi.com/gifts. Or if you're interested in trying it out for yourself, you can get an entire month of great cinema for free by going to mubi.com/royalocean to sign up today.